The air on Christmas morning, 1852, was a cold, wet shroud clinging to the Mississippi. It carried the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet, that clung to the back of the throat. At Belle Reve, the grand sugar plantation of Antoine Lepage, the world was supposed to awaken to the peal of church bells and the promise of a holy day. A brief, fragile respite from the relentless cycle of the cane. Instead, it awoke to a scream. It was not a shriek of terror, but a low, guttural sound of disbelief, a sound that seemed to tear its way out of the very soul of the house. The sound came from Eleanor Lepage, a woman whose voice was usually as soft and controlled as the lace at her wrists. It was a sound that brought the house servants running, their bare feet slapping against the cold heart pine floors. They found her standing in the doorway of her husband's study, a silhouette of black silk against the pale morning light, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other pointing a trembling finger into the room's opulent gloom. Inside, Antoine Lepage, master of Belle Reve, patriarch of the parish, and a man whose piety was as renowned as his fortune, was dead. He was not in his bed, nor had he been struck down by some sudden, gentlemanly ailment of the heart. He was slumped in his favorite leather wingback chair, the one position to overlook the fields of cane that were the source of his wealth and his power. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were wide open, staring at some unseen horror just beyond the window pane. A string of black rosary beads, his constant companion, was wrapped, not around his fingers in prayer, but tightly, brutally, around his throat. The small silver crucifix was pressed deep into the flesh beneath his jaw, a final, blasphemous brand. The lingering scent in the air was whiskey and extinguished life. There was no blood. No sign of a struggle beyond the overturned inkwell on his mahogany desk. A black stain spreading slowly across a letter he had been writing, the ink bleeding into the fine paper like a creeping rot. The only other person who should have been in the great house, the last man to see the master alive, was gone. His name was Samuel. He was the plantation's blacksmith, and the man who had driven his master's carriage home from midnight mass. To understand the silence that followed the scream, one had to understand the suffocating order of Belle Reve. It was a world built on the fiction of benevolent control, a meticulously crafted stage play where every actor knew his part. Antoine Lepage was the playwright, director, and lead. He was a man of medium height, but immense presence, with a ramrod posture and a face that seemed carved from unyielding stone. He did not raise his voice. A quiet word, a disappointed sigh, a long, assessing stare from those gray eyes. These were his tools, and they were sharper than any lash. He spoke of his duty to his people, of the Christian burden to bring civilization to the savage, and he performed his role with theatrical perfection. On Sundays, he sat in the front pew of St. Joseph's, his family beside him, a portrait of devout prosperity. He quoted Scripture as easily as he calculated profits. He believed, with an unshakable conviction that was more terrifying than any overt cruelty, in his own righteousness. His world was the rustle of the sugarcane, a sound that was the constant, whispering pulse of their lives. In the summer it was a soft green hiss, a promise of the wealth to come. By the grinding season it was a dry, frantic rattle, the sound of a million tiny bones breaking. For the enslaved of Belle Reve, the cane was a living monster. Its leaves were serrated razors that sliced at their hands and faces, leaving a crosshatch of scars that never fully faded. The Louisiana sun beat down upon it, turning the fields into a furnace that shimmered with heat and misery. The sweet, cloying smell of the boiling house during the roulaison was the smell of exhaustion, of sleepless nights and scalded flesh, the smell of their lives being rendered down, like the cane, into pure, profitable sweetness for another man's table. Samuel knew these sounds and smells better than he knew the face of his own mother, sold downriver when he was just a boy. He was a man built of the elements he commanded, tall and broad, forged in the heat and smoke of his smithy. His skin was the color of rich, dark soil, and his arms, corded with muscle from the swing of the hammer, bore the faint silvery tracks of old burns. But it was his hands that defined him. They were immense, calloused, capable of shaping raw iron into the delicate scrollwork of a garden gate, or the brutal efficiency of a cane knife. They could soothe a frightened horse with a single touch, or bend a steel bar with slow, inexorable pressure. His domain was the blacksmith's shop, a dark, cavernous space set away from the great house, near the stables. It was a place of elemental power, of fire and shadow. The rhythmic clang of his hammer on the anvil was the plantation's other heartbeat, a counterpoint to the rustling cane. It was a sound of creation, of resistance. Here, in the searing glow of the forge, surrounded by the acrid smells of hot metal and coal smoke, Samuel was not merely property. He was an artisan, a master of a violent, beautiful craft. He understood the nature of things, how to find the breaking point of iron, how much heat it could endure before it lost its integrity, how much pressure it took to reshape it into something new. These were lessons he applied to the world beyond the forge as well. He watched, he listened, and he measured the breaking points of men. His wife was Eliza, a house servant whose quiet grace seemed a miracle in that brutal place. She moved through the rooms of the great house like a phantom, her presence felt but rarely acknowledged by the LePage family. She and Samuel had a daughter, Sarah, a small, bright-eyed girl of 7, who had her mother's smile and a spirit that even Belle Reve had not yet managed to crush. Their life together was a stolen thing, conducted in whispers and fleeting glances, in moments snatched in the darkness between the end of Samuel's day and the beginning of Eliza's. Their cabin, one of a dozen identical structures of mud and cypress, was a sanctuary. It was where they could shed the masks they wore for the white world, where Samuel could hold his daughter and tell her stories of Brer Rabbit, tales of the weak outsmarting the strong, and where he and Eliza could simply be. It was a fragile, precious world built in the shadow of the monster. The monster, Antoine Lepage, considered himself a good master. He provided food, not ample, but enough. He provided shelter, not comfortable, but sufficient. He provided God, a version of the Almighty, who sanctioned his dominion and demanded obedience from the flock. He rarely used the whip himself, leaving that to his overseer, a man named Moreau, a petty tyrant with sweat-stained clothes and a cruel, lazy smile. LePage preferred psychological tools. He would grant small favors only to snatch them away. He would praise a man one day and humiliate him the next, keeping everyone off balance, mired in a state of perpetual anxiety. His most potent weapon was the threat of separation. The words, "sold to Texas," were a death sentence, a promise of a harder life, and a final, brutal severing of all ties. It was a threat he wielded with the precision of a surgeon. The chain of events that would end on Christmas morning began not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating transaction on a humid afternoon in late September. It began with a visitor, a horse trader from the West, with a hearty laugh and eyes as cold and empty as a snake's. He and LePage sat on the veranda, drinking brandy and discussing prices, the price of mules, of cotton, and of people. Samuel was shoeing the trader's horse nearby, the rhythmic fall of his hammer, a steady percussion to their conversation. He could hear their voices, the murmur of commerce, the casual dehumanization that was the language of their world. He did not pay it much mind until he heard a name that made his hammer freeze in mid-air. Sarah. LePage was describing her. Bright girl, strong for her age, good teeth. She'll make a fine lady's maid in a few years, the trader grunted. And the mother? Eliza, a good breeder, docile. I'll not part with her. But the girl is a surplus asset. The world narrowed for Samuel. The buzzing of the cicadas, the smell of the hot iron, the weight of the hammer in his hand. It all faded into a roaring in his ears. An asset. His daughter, his Sarah, who loved the taste of stolen sugar cane and who fell asleep with her small hand clutching his finger, was an asset to be liquidated. The hammer fell from his grasp, clanging loudly on the packed earth. LePage's head snapped in his direction. Those gray eyes narrowed. "Samuel, is there a problem?" Samuel's throat was a knot of fire. He could not speak. He could only stare, and in his eyes, for the first time, LePage saw not the deference of a slave, but the raw, untamed fury of a man. It was a flicker, a brief, incandescent flash of hatred, but it was enough. LePage's expression hardened. It was a look of offense, of a king whose authority had been momentarily, unthinkably questioned. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the trader. The deal was done. They took her the next morning. Eliza's wails were a sound that ripped the fabric of the dawn. She clung to Sarah, a desperate, primal knot of motherhood that the overseer, Moreau, had to pry apart. Samuel stood frozen by his forge, his powerful hands clenched into useless fists at his sides. He watched. The trader's wagon rumbled down the long avenue of oaks, taking his daughter, his future, with it. He watched until it was just a dust cloud on the horizon. He did not go to Eliza. He could not. There was no comfort he could offer, for his own soul had been hollowed out, leaving behind only a cold, echoing emptiness and the embers of a rage too vast to comprehend. From that day, something shifted in the atmosphere of Belrave. The careful illusion of order began to fray at the edges. Samuel became a specter of silent diligence. The clang of his hammer was no longer rhythmic and steady. It became harder, more frantic, as if he were trying to beat the iron into submission, to punish it for its malleability. He worked longer hours, his body slick with sweat, his face a mask of grim concentration. The fire of the forge was a cool relief compared to the inferno blazing within him. He stopped speaking unless spoken to, and when he did, his voice was a low, gravelly rasp, the sound of grinding stones. Eliza withered. The light in her eyes extinguished. She moved through the great house like a sleepwalker, her hands performing their duties while her mind was 1,000 miles away, down a dusty road to Texas. She and Samuel would lie next to each other in their cabin at night, two bodies separated by an ocean of unspoken grief. Their silence was a shared wound, too deep to touch. LePage noticed the change, of course. He noticed everything. He saw the hatred in Samuel's eyes, no longer a flicker but a steady, banked fire. He saw the desolation in Eliza, and it pleased him. It was a reassertion of his power, a confirmation of his absolute control over their lives, their bodies, their very hearts. He began to single Samuel out. He would find fault with his work, a perfectly mended plowshare that was, not to his standard, a set of hinges that were crude. He would stand in the doorway of the smithy for long stretches, simply watching, his presence a constant, oppressive weight. It was a game of nerves, a slow, deliberate turning of the screw. He wanted to see Samuel break. He wanted to see him beg, to weep, to reaffirm his own godlike power. But Samuel would not break. He would only meet LePage's gaze with a flat, unreadable stare, and incline his head in a gesture of submission that was a profound and insolent mockery of the real thing. He was no longer a slave in his own mind. He was a man waiting. He had begun to study LePage the way he studied a piece of flawed iron, looking for the stress points, the internal fractures, the precise spot to strike. He observed his routines, the morning ride, the afternoon brandy on the veranda, the nightly inventory of his own soul in his leather-bound ledger, and he began to pray. He had always been a quiet observer in the back of the church. listening to the Latin he did not understand, and the sermons on obedience he understood all too well. The God of the white man seemed a distant, capricious landlord. But now Samuel's prayers were different. They were not pleas for deliverance. They were not requests for comfort. They were hard, sharp, and honed. He would stand before the cooling embers of his forge at night, the sweat drying on his skin, and he would speak to a God of his own understanding, a God of fire and iron, a God of vengeance. He would hold a piece of cooled steel in his hand and pray for its strength, for its unyielding nature to enter his own heart. He did not pray for Sarah to be returned. He knew that was a child's dream. He prayed for justice, a concept as hard and clean as a freshly forged blade. As the grinding season reached its peak, the tension on the plantation became as thick and suffocating as the smoke from the boiling house. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The cane fell to the ceaseless swing of the knives, and the air was filled with the groaning of the mill. One evening, Moreau, drunk and emboldened by LePage's campaign of psychological warfare, cornered Eliza in the pantry. His intentions were unmistakable. Eliza's scream brought Samuel running from the quarters, a speed and silence in his movement that was terrifying. He did not burst in. He appeared in the doorway, a massive, silent shadow. He did not have a weapon, but he did not need one. He simply stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes glowing with the reflected light of the forge that still burned in his soul. Moreau, a man who dealt in casual brutality, saw something in Samuel's face that he had never seen before. Not the fear of a slave, but the promise of an executioner. He backed away, stammering, and fled into the night. Samuel did not say a word. He looked at Eliza, who was huddled against the shelves, her body trembling. He saw the fresh terror in her eyes, and he saw the ghost of his daughter, and he knew that there was no safety, no sanctuary, as long as Antoine Lepage drew breath. The world he and Eliza had built was not just in the shadow of the monster. It was in its belly, waiting to be digested. That night, the first real cold snap of winter arrived. A mist rolled in from the river, wreathing the cypress trees in spectral white. Spanish moss, which had always looked like the tattered garments of old men, now looked like funeral shrouds hanging from the branches. The world seemed to be holding its breath. It was the week before Christmas. LePage, blind to the storm he had unleashed, saw the coming holiday as the ultimate stage for his performance of benevolent mastery. He announced that, as was his tradition, he would attend midnight mass in Baton Rouge, and that the house servants would be rewarded with a traditional *Réveillon* feast upon his return. It was a gesture meant to demonstrate his piety and his generosity, a public reaffirmation of the lie of Bel Rêve. He summoned Samuel to the great house. "You will drive the carriage tonight," LePage said, not as a question, but as a decree. He was standing before the fireplace in his study, the same room where he would take his last breath. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the room seem alive and sinister. "Have the horses ready, and see that you are presentable." Samuel simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the string of black rosary beads that dangled from LePage's hand as he gestured. The beads, made of polished onyx, looked like a chain of captured shadows. The silver crucifix at its end caught the firelight, winking like a malevolent eye. Samuel had seen LePage with those beads 1,000 times, clutching them in church, running them through his fingers as he watched the field hands, holding them as he sentenced a man to the lash. They were not an instrument of faith. They were a symbol of his power, a physical manifestation of the divine right he believed he possessed. Christmas Eve descended on Belle Reve like a judgment. The air was unnaturally still, the sky a bruised, starless purple. The enslaved were given their holiday rations, a small measure of pork, some molasses, a dram of whiskey, gifts that felt more like insults than charity. A forced air of festivity hung over the quarters, thin and brittle. There were songs, but they were sung in a minor key, full of sorrow and a longing for a freedom that felt as distant as the stars that refused to shine. Samuel prepared the carriage with meticulous care. He polished the brass lamps until they gleamed. He brushed the coats of the 2 black horses, whispering to them in a low, soothing tone that belied the tempest in his soul. He dressed in the livery LePage provided, a wool coat that was too tight in the shoulders, a painful constraint. When he was done, he went to his cabin. Eliza was sitting on their small cot, staring at the empty space where Sarah's pallet used to be. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide with a fear she could not name. "Be careful, Samuel," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. He knelt before her and, for the first time in months, took her hands in his. They were cold. "I will," he said. And in his voice she heard not reassurance, but finality. He was not just going to Baton Rouge. He was journeying to the end of something. He kissed her forehead, a brief, desperate press of his lips against her skin, and then he was gone, swallowed by the suffocating darkness. The ride to Baton Rouge was a silent battle of wills. LePage sat in the carriage, a cloaked figure of rigid piety, occasionally murmuring the rosary. Samuel sat on the driver's perch, his back as straight and unyielding as his master's. The only sounds were the clopping of the horses' hooves, the creak of the leather harnesses, and the rustle of the wind through the skeletal branches of the oaks that lined the road. The Spanish moss swayed in the lamplight, reaching out like ghostly fingers. To Samuel, the road was a passage through a haunted world, each cypress a silent ancient witness to a century of sorrow. He could feel LePage's presence behind him, a cold weight on his back, a pressure in the air. He was acutely aware of every breath his master took, every shift in his seat. The church was an explosion of light and sound in the dark town. Hundreds of candles flickered, their light glinting off the gold of the altar and the rich vestments of the priest. The air was thick with the heady soporific scent of incense and melting beeswax. The choir's voices soared into the rafters, singing of peace on earth and goodwill toward men. The Latin chants, meant to be comforting, sounded to Samuel like an incantation, a spell to keep the world in its ordained unjust order. He stood at the back, as was his place, near the massive oak doors. He watched LePage kneel in the front pew, his head bowed in a perfect pantomime of humility. He saw him take out the black rosary, his fingers moving over the beads with practiced ease. Samuel looked at the stained-glass windows depicting the suffering of the saints, at the larger-than-life crucifix that hung above the altar, a depiction of a man tortured and killed by the powers of the state. He had heard the story his whole life, the story of a God who had sacrificed his only son. But tonight, he saw it differently. He did not see a story of salvation. He saw a story of a father who had allowed his child to be taken and murdered. He saw a God who understood his own grief, his own rage. The line between the sacred and the profane, between the martyr and the victim, blurred into nothing. The incense choked him. The singing was a meaningless drone. The entire ceremony was a monument to a colossal lie, and Antoine Lepage was its chief architect. When the Mass concluded, a wave of parishioners spilled out into the cold night, their faces flushed with piety and holiday cheer, their mouths full of blessings. LePage emerged, his face serene, as if he had been genuinely cleansed. He nodded to Samuel, a gesture of a king to a functionary, and climbed back into the carriage. The journey home was even quieter than the journey there. The world was now past midnight. It was Christmas Day. A sliver of moon had appeared, casting a sickly silver light on the landscape. The mist had thickened, and the carriage lamps cut feeble yellow tunnels through the swirling gray. They were alone, 2 men in a box, rattling through a sleeping, haunted world. They were halfway back to Belle Rive when LePage spoke. His voice, startling in the silence, was smooth, laced with the self-satisfaction of a man at peace with his God. "A beautiful service," he said. more to himself than to Samuel. It is good to be reminded of God's grace, of the proper order of things. He paused, then added, "He sees all, Samuel. He sees the faithful and the ungrateful. He punishes the wicked heart." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. The horses sensed his tension, their ears twitching. He said nothing. LePage seemed to take his silence as an invitation to continue. He was feeling expansive, perhaps, full of the Spirit of the Lord and the brandy he had sipped before Mass. Take your wife, for example. Her grief over the girl, it is unchristian, a sign of a weak and faithless spirit. We must all accept God's will. The girl is in a better place, learning a trade, being civilized. Eliza should be grateful for the opportunity I have provided. Instead, she mourns. It is an indulgence I have tolerated long enough. After the new year, I believe a taste of the field might correct her perspective. The sun, instead, the cane have a way of burning away such sentimentality. The world stopped. The clopping of the hooves, the creaking of the carriage, the whisper of the wind, it all ceased. There was only LePage's voice, hanging in the cold air, and the roar in Samuel's ears, which was now the sound of a blast furnace. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, in 1,000 different ways. He had imagined a fight, a desperate struggle in the dark. He had imagined a confession, a scream, a plea. But as he pulled the horses to a halt, in the middle of the dark, cypress-lined road, he felt a profound and terrifying calm. The waiting was over. He wrapped the reins around the brake handle and turned on the driver's perch. His movement was slow, deliberate, almost reptilian. LePage, startled by the sudden stop, looked up. "What is the meaning of this? Drive on!" Samuel did not answer. He swung his large frame off the perch and landed silently on the damp ground. He walked to the carriage door and opened it. The lamplight fell on his face, and for the first time, Antoine Lepage saw him without the mask of servitude. He saw the face of the God of fire and iron that Samuel had been praying to. There was no hatred in his eyes, no rage. There was only a vast, cold emptiness, the stillness of a final decision. What are you doing?" LePage stammered, his piety evaporating into a puddle of raw fear. He fumbled inside his coat, his hand searching for the small pistol he sometimes carried. Samuel moved with the speed he had shown in the pantry, a blur of motion that belied his size. He was inside the carriage before LePage could react, his massive body filling the small space, sucking all the air out of it. One of his large, calloused hands shot out and clamped around LePage's wrist, the one that was reaching for the gun. He squeezed, and LePage cried out as he felt the bones grind together. The other hand shot to LePage's throat, but he did not choke him. Not yet. He simply held him there, pinned against the velvet cushions, their faces inches apart. The smell of fear, a sour, animal scent, poured off LePage. The smell of brandy was on his breath. Samuel could see the reflection of the carriage lamp in his master's wide, terrified eyes. My daughter," Samuel said, his voice a low growl, the first words he had spoken to his master in a personal capacity since the day Sarah was sold. "You called her an asset." "It was business," LePage gasped, his voice thin and reedy. "You cannot understand." "I understand the nature of things," Samuel whispered. "I know what it takes to break them." He released LePage's wrist and, with his free hand, reached into the master's waistcoat pocket. He pulled out the black rosary. LePage's eyes followed the movement, his terror turning to confusion, then to a dawning, ultimate horror. "You pray with these," Samuel said, his voice devoid of all emotion. He let the beads dangle between them. The silver crucifix swung gently, catching the light. "You ask your God for forgiveness." He brought the beads up, his movements fluid and certain. "Let's see if he hears you now." He looped the strand of onyx beads around LePage's neck. LePage began to struggle then, a frantic, pathetic thrashing. He clawed at Samuel's hands, his manicured nails scraping uselessly against skin as tough as old leather. Samuel ignored him. He crossed the rosary behind LePage's head, pulled it taut, and began to twist. The sound was not loud. It was a series of small, wet, desperate noises. A choked gasp, a high-pitched wheezing, the frantic drumming of LePage's boots against the carriage floor. Samuel watched his master's face, his expression as intent and focused as it was when he was shaping a piece of hot iron. He watched the confident gray eyes bulge, the patrician face turn a mottled purple. He saw the surprise, the disbelief that this could be happening, that the world he commanded could so suddenly and completely turn on him. He felt the life of his master pulsing against the pressure of the beads, a frantic, trapped bird, and then he felt it subside. He kept twisting, his blacksmith's arms providing a steady, relentless pressure until there was no movement at all. He held it for a long time after, ensuring the work was done, the iron fully bent to his will. When he was finished, he uncoiled his body and stepped out of the carriage. The perfectified night air was cold on his face. He did not look back at the thing slumped in the seat. He walked to the horses, who stood patiently in the mist, their breath pluming in the air. He murmured to them, stroked their necks, and untied the reins. He climbed back onto the driver's perch and, with a soft click of his tongue, urged them forward. He drove the rest of the way, to Belle Reve, at a slow, funereal pace. He did not stop at the great house. He drove the carriage, with its silent, grotesque cargo, directly to the stables. He unhitched the horses, led them to their stalls, and gave them water. He moved with the unhurried calm of a man who has completed a long and difficult task. Every action was precise, deliberate. When the horses were tended to, he walked, not to his own cabin, but to the great house. The Réveillon * feast was laid out in the kitchen, but the house servants were huddled together, whispering, sensing that something was wrong. The master was late. Samuel walked past them without a word. He went through the dining room, past the long, polished table set for a feast that would never be eaten. He entered the master's study. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. He walked to the wingback chair, the one overlooking the fields. He lifted the body of Antoine LePage from the carriage, carried him inside as if he were a sack of grain, and arranged him in the chair. He positioned him to face the window, to face the source of his power, now a dark, sleeping expanse under the sliver of moon. He made sure the rosary was still in place, the crucifix pressed into the flesh like a seal. He took the half-written letter from the desk, the one stained with ink, and placed it in LePage's lap. Then, he turned and walked out of the house. He did not run. He walked with a steady, unhurried stride, past his own cabin where Eliza waited in the darkness, past the quarters where his people slept a restless, dream-filled sleep. He walked past his forge, its fires now banked and cold. He walked down the long avenue of oaks, the Spanish moss brushing against his shoulders like a final benediction. He did not look back. He walked toward the river, toward the swamp, toward the great, unknowable darkness that lay beyond the neatly ordered rows of sugar cane. He was a man walking out of a story, out of a life, and into a legend. He was just a shape, a shadow, and then he was gone, swallowed by the mist and the night. The discovery on Christmas morning threw the parish into chaos. Sheriff Beaumont, a pragmatic, weary man whose job was mostly settling land disputes and dealing with drunks, arrived at Belle Reve before noon. He looked at the body of Antoine LePage, at the rosary, at the expression of frozen terror on the dead man's face, and felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was not a robbery. This was not a crime of passion. This was an execution. It was an act of profound, blasphemous symbolism that struck at the very heart of their world. The manhunt was immediate and brutal. Posses were formed, armed with rifles and shotguns. their ranks swelled by frightened and furious plantation owners who saw in LePage's death a terrifying portent of their own. They brought the dogs, their baying a savage music that echoed through the swamps. They rode through the quarters of Belle Rive, dragging men from their cabins, questioning, threatening, beating. Moreau, the overseer, was particularly vicious, using the investigation as an excuse to settle old scores, his fear manifesting as unhinged cruelty. Eliza was interrogated by Rouge, Sheriff Beaumont himself. He was not a cruel man, but he was a man of his time and his class, and he could not conceive of the world from her perspective. He saw only a frightened slave woman. He asked her about Samuel, about his moods, his habits, his whereabouts. Eliza, her face a mask of numb grief, said nothing. She stared at a point on the wall behind the sheriff's head, her silence, a wall he could not breach. He saw her silence as ignorance, not as an act of profound and courageous loyalty. He did not know that her heart had gone with Samuel into the swamp, and that she was already dead in all the ways that mattered. The hunt lasted for weeks. They combed the bayous and the cypress swamps, a labyrinth of black water, sucking mud, and tangled vegetation. It was a place that did not obey the white man's laws of property and order. It was ancient, primal, and secretive. They found traces of him, a footprint here, a broken branch there. They followed his trail to the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, a wilderness so vast and impenetrable, it was said a man could disappear into it and never be seen again. Some of the trackers claimed the dogs would whine and refused to follow the scent near the dark water, as if Samuel were protected by something older and more powerful than them. The official story, the one that was entered into the parish records and repeated in the parlors of Baton Rouge, was simple and satisfying. Samuel was a brute, a devil who had murdered his kind, Christian master in a fit of savage rage. He was hunted down and, in the end, shot and killed while resisting capture, his body sinking without a trace into the black, greedy mud of the swamp. It was a neat and tidy ending, a reassertion of order, a cautionary tale to be whispered in the slave quarters. For years to come, the system had righted itself, the monster had been slain. But another story began to circulate, a story told not in official records but in whispers around cabin fires, in the coded language of songs sung in the fields. This was Samuel's story, and in this telling he was not a monster. He was a phantom, a spirit of vengeance. They said he had never been caught. They said the swamp had swallowed him, not to kill him, but to protect him. Some said he had become a *loop guru, a shapeshifter who haunted the back roads, a protector of the oppressed. Others said that he had been guided by the spirits of the ancestors, who had opened a path for him through the impassable wilderness, a path that led north to freedom. They said that on still nights, when the moon was just a sliver in the sky, you could still hear the faint, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, echoing from the heart of the swamp, a sound of ceaseless, patient forging. Belle Rive did not survive the death of its master. Eleanor LePage, broken and haunted, sold the plantation within a year and moved back to New Orleans, disappearing into the city's cloistered Creole society. The new owners lacked LePage's meticulous genius for cruelty and profit. The crops faltered, the finances crumbled, and within a decade, the great house was abandoned, its windows boarded up, its fields slowly being reclaimed by the wild, tenacious Louisiana landscape. The sugarcane grew tangled and feral, and the avenue of oaks became a dark, foreboding tunnel. The place became a ghost story, a testament to the idea that a foundation built on blood and lies cannot hold. Asterisk, 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 epilogue. The year is 1936. A young man with a notepad and a pencil, working for the Federal Writers Project, sits on the porch of a weathered shack on the outskirts of Plaquemine. The air is thick with the scent of jasmine and decay. He is here to collect the stories of the formerly enslaved, to capture the memories of a generation on the verge of disappearing. Before him sits an old woman named Cecile. Her face is a beautiful, intricate map of a long and difficult life. her eyes cloudy with cataracts but still sharp with intelligence. She is, she says, nearly 90 years old. She was a child on a plantation near Baton Rouge. She does not remember its name. The writer asks her about her life, about the work, the food, the masters. She answers in a quiet, reedy voice, her memories distant and fragmented. He is about to pack up, to thank her for her time, when he asks one last question, a standard one on his list. Do you remember any stories, any tales the old folks used to tell? Cecile is silent for a long time. She looks out past the porch railing, toward the distant line of cypress trees that marks the edge of the swamp. A change comes over her face. The fog of age seems to lift, and a fire flickers in the depths of her old eyes. They told us of Samuel, she says, her voice suddenly stronger, clearer. Samuel of the forge. The writer leans forward, his pencil poised. Who was he? He was a man, she says. A world of meaning in that simple statement. A blacksmith. A big, quiet man with hands that could bend iron. He had a wife, Eliza, and a little girl, the master. The master sold the girl. She pauses, and her gnarled hand clenches into a fist on her lap. They say the master thought he had broken him. But you cannot break iron. You can only heat it, and bend it, and make it into something else. Something harder, something sharp. She tells him the story. She tells him of the midnight mass, of the carriage ride, of the black rosary. Her telling is not like a history, it is like an epic poem. She describes the feel of the cold night air, the smell of the incense in the church, the sound of the master's last choked breath. The writer scribbles furiously, trying to keep up. Did they catch him? He asks when she is finished. Cecile smiles, a slow, mysterious smile that reveals gums and a few remaining teeth. The white folks say they did. They say they shot him and fed him to the gators. She leans forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But my grandmother, she was Eliza's friend. She told me the truth. Eliza never believed he was dead. She said that sometimes, on the night he left, she would feel a cool breeze come in the cabin, even with the door shut. It smelled of the swamp, and of hot metal. And she knew he was safe. She knew he was free. The old woman looks at the writer, her gaze direct and penetrating. Some men, they die, and they are forgotten. Their names are dust. But Samuel, he did not die. A man like that cannot die. He became a story. And a story, young man. A story is a place where a soul can live forever. The writer thanks her and leaves, his mind reeling. As he drives away back toward the paved roads and the modern world, he glances in his rearview mirror. The old woman is still on her porch, a small, still figure watching him go. Behind her, the cypress trees stand like ancient sentinels, their branches draped in moss, guarding the secrets of the swamp. The sun is setting, and the sky is the color of a dying fire. He thinks about the nature of justice, about the unseen, unwritten histories that lie just beneath the surface of the world. He thinks about a man's hands, a string of beads, and an act of violence that was also, in its own terrible, tragic way, an act of creation, the creation of a legend. And for a fleeting moment, carried on the humid evening air, he thinks he can hear it, a faint, impossibly distant, rhythmic sound, like a hammer striking an anvil. A sound like a heartbeat, refusing to be silenced.